Good morning. Happy Friday. As I like to say, it is the end of the week. It's the last day. For those of you who've been with us all week, welcome back. And this is your first day. Just a reminder, my name is Miss Farr. My partner in crime is Mr. Horton, and we're tag teaming this for A Push. I am at Cambridge High School in Milton, Georgia, by way of Atlanta, home of the Braves, the Hawks, and every other kind of bird type of situation when it comes to a mascot that you can possibly think of. We're going to go ahead and jump right into it today. This is the last unit that we will cover for period 9 before we will jump into next week, which will start our review. So if this is your first day tuning in and you're wondering when are we going to start reviewing periods 1 through 7, that will actually start on Monday. And I'm going to jump us off on Monday with period 1. So I'm very happy to have you guys back, and we're going to kind of hop right into it. As always, we usually start off our lessons with a warm up, and you guys kind of got a glimpse of the warm up from yesterday. Also, don't forget, Mr. Horton, my partner in crime, is manning our Twitter page. So if you have questions or anything that you want to ask about the lesson, and I will kind of give you some questions today throughout the lesson, please make sure that you put that information onto our Twitter account, which is at virtual a push. Before we get started, I did want to give a couple of shout outs to some wonderful teachers who have been either tuning in with us every day, they have emailed us, they have tweeted, they have responded to questions. They have been so gracious in their feedback, and they have been very appreciative of all of our hard work that we're doing here to kind of help you guys prepare. So thank you so much to Alina Yanitz, Constance Hines, Catherine Mullally, Christine Tram, and Patrick Galogly. Apologize if I messed that name up, but we thank you so much. It is such a blessing when we get feedback from colleagues from around the world who are appreciative of everything that we're doing. And so please continue to tune in. Please invite your students to continue to tune in. And as always, we will continue to give them shout outs as well. And our students have been really, really gracious in saying thank you for their teachers and all the hard work that they've done, and calling some of you guys some of the best A push teachers they've had. All right, so here is our question, which is explain the relative significance of the effects of change in the period after 1980 on American national identity. Now, I want you to kind of think about something when we say this. The period after 1980, which is now, on American national identity. What do we call this period? We're currently still in the middle of this era. We're talking about 40 years later after 1980. We're currently in the 23rd century. Like, what do we do? Like, how do we look at this and identify this? Like, what do we call this? It doesn't have a name, like the Gilded Age or the Progressive Era, the Age of Imperialism. Like, how would you guys identify this age? So as I'm kind of going through and wrapping things up for period 9, tweet your responses to Mr. Horton about if you could definitely give this era a name, what would you call it? And kind of look at some of the significant changes and impacts that we've had up until this point. All right, always, we're talking about causation. We're again going to explain the relative significance of effects of change in the period after 1980 on the national identity. Um, we've been working on sourcing and situation. We've been working on contextualization. Today, we're going to be working more so on the skill of argumentation. This is very important when it comes to writing your DBQ because you're going to need to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument by using diverse and alternative evidence in order to develop a complex argument. So that means using your documents as well as using some outside information in order to assist you so that you can go ahead and get that information in order to help your argument. So, what do we need to know? If we could kind of look at the period 1980 from going forward, there's a lot of important things that happened in this era, and it's impossible to kind of create a timeline that will kind of pull everything in. So I kind of just pulled out some important dates of just big pivotal things that were kind of globally. In 1980, we saw the election of Reagan, which was very important because his election kind of led to the end of the Iran hostage situation. In 89, we saw the end of the Cold War. We saw the thawing with perestroika and glasnost, the fact that the Soviet Union was now turning into more capitalism versus communism. We also saw with Gorbachev, who would later go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in with the Cold War and also the fall of the Berlin Wall. We saw the emergence of the Persian Gulf War and the fact of how we got involved with the situation with Iraq and Kuwait and the fight for American oil fields. In 1995, we saw the Oklahoma City bombing. That was the first type of bombing that we actually saw that caliber with a situation where it was kind of like a cult movement. And this guy decided that he wanted to bomb a couple of buildings. And I remember that because I was actually a senior in high school about to graduate when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred. We saw the infamous election of Bush versus Gore. And this was the first election that I actually voted in, and the controversy of the hanging Chad, and if you're not voting for Gore, who are you actually voting for? And the fact that this went actually to a Supreme Court case before Gore conceded to Bush. We saw the 9/11 attacks, and Mr. Horton did a very good job yesterday of going through that and having to think about where I was during that time when I saw that. And I wasn't actually even in a classroom at that time. I was actually working in radio and television, so I can remember passing by and seeing the building, blow up and the planes and everything, and thinking, is this real or is this like a movie situation? The Great Recession of 2008. I don't know how many of you guys even remember this. You might be too young, but we actually went through a gas crisis. And this is not the first gas crisis that we actually had been through, but there was a point where, because of everything that was happening with the war on terrorism and the fact that we were fighting fighting so many different entities within the Middle East, the oil prices in America had went up, and they also started rejecting certain oil, so that it actually did lead to a gasoline crisis. And just you having to go to gas stations and there was no gas available. And if you actually saw a gas truck, you would actually follow that gas truck so you could fill up your car, because everyone was so afraid that they would run out of gas. In 2008, we saw the election of President Obama, the first African American to ever be elected to office. And then in 2011, we saw the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, where it was a universal health care system. And he was the actual first president to actually get it passed through both the Senate and the House of Representatives. He's not going to be the first president to actually try that. Clinton actually tried to do a universal health care plan. Unfortunately, his plan did not actually come to fruition. And I think that was actually some residual kind of leftover from what happened with the NAFTA deal. So if you looked at all the dates and kind of things, and I kind of just breezed through almost 40 something years of things that happened within inside of this period. Again, this is not everything. These are just some highlights. So let's kind of talk about another thing that we looked at, conservatism. Now, we talked about the age of conservatism around the Nixon era, and we talked about how Barry Goldwater is going to be kind of seen as the leader of the conservative movement. Conservatism is going to come back. It's going to kind of see a little bit of a decline during after Nixon's incident, and then of course, with Ford, and then with Carter and with Reagan. Conservatives were always there, but once you kind of got leadership like Newt Gingrich in place, that's really going to kind of bring it back into the forefront. And again, they're going to believe in a traditional societal values. They wanted to see a reduced role for government. And, kind of thinking back to that question that Mr. Horton asked you, conservatism now will be compared to which political party that first started out in the early republic? Would it be Federalists, or would it be the Jeffersonian Democrats? Who would be looking at a reduced role for the government? Kind of thinking about that. So tweet your answers to Mr. Horton while I'm continuing to go through. We looked at Reagan's victory and the era of conservative and how to cut taxes and deregulate industries, talking about Reaganomics and trickle-down economics. They believed that liberal policies were pretty much ineffective. And they also kind of continued debates over free trade and the power of the government and social reforms. And we saw a lot of social reforms that came about in the late 70s and moving into the 80s. And these social reforms are still going to be at the forefront. Now you're looking at health and the rise of the AIDS epidemic that's going to happen in the 1980s, the role of feminism, that whole glass ceiling, that's going to be a huge part of it, with equal pay, women kind of taking on those roles. It's just a plethora of social reforms that we're looking at. And also with the gay and lesbian community and their acceptance and getting more laws that are going to be more in arguing in their favor. And things such as Title IX and people with disabilities. All of these are going to be social reforms and kind of looking at the impact that the government had at the time. We're looking at new technology as well. The fact that things that weren't available then are now going to be soon available. Cell phones, computers, the World Wide Web. I know you guys are thinking, Was there ever a time when nobody had a smartphone? Yes, there was. I actually grew up in an era where we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the World Wide Web. We had to do kind of everything. You had to actually physically go into the library, and you actually had to learn something called the Dewey Decimal System. It wasn't as simple as typing in something in a computer and then having some and being able to find the book that quickly. You actually had to know and understand how the Dewey Decimal System worked. Um, think about COVID-19 and everything that we're going through. How would our world survive if we didn't have computers and World Wide Web and Google and all those things that we get our information from and all those different social media platforms? What would that look like? How would we know the information and all of the warnings that the CDC and the World Health Organization has issued out in order to kind of get countries to be aware of what's happening and how that we can kind of flatten the curve of this pandemic? Um, the fact that you have access to information. Never before did we have things like Google Maps or Waze. If you wanted to go to someone's house, you actually had to have a map. You had to write down directions. You actually had to know how to read a map in order to find that. Now you just type in the address, hit start, and it'll guide you step by step and tell you when to turn and give you even better directions than before. Um, we're looking at the fact that manufacturing and union membership will decrease in certain sectors. While there are still unions that still exist today, for example, teachers, plumbers, all those different types of things. But a lot of the organizations that did have union memberships, they're going to kind of decrease and then eventually they're going to kind of go away. And then we're going to see stagnant wages for the middle class increase. The fact that economic inequality is really going to be brought to the forefront. A lot of people say that Reaganomics had a lot to do with that because his idea was give tax breaks to those who were considered to be rich or upper class, and then they will then funnel their money back into the economy. But some of the other classes felt that the taxes were unevenly distributed because of the fact that they had to pay more taxes. So technology does play a huge role. So as you're thinking about what name would we give this era, think about technology and the information that you have. Think about this, the conservatism role. Is conservatism still here today, or are we considered to be more liberal? Then we got to look at demographic change, the rise of immigration, the fact that we had shifts in population, which will have both cultural and political consequences. We're starting to see that eventually there was a theory that Spanish will actually be spoken more in the United States and actually will become the primary language, and English will become a secondary language. Um, we're going to see migrants come more from Latin America and also Asia. That's going to increase dramatically. And then, of course, you have intense debates about diversity, about gender roles, about family. Back, when we talked about the traditional family where the man worked and the woman stayed home, she took care of the children. Now we're seeing more two-income families. And as a matter of fact, the majority of the families that exist in America today cannot survive without two incomes. The cost of living has majorly increased. And what has had an impact on that? Well, you think about it, all the availability, all of the technology, things like that, cars, everything that you have to afford in order to have what is considered to be a good way of life now requires for you to have more than one income. And even still, in some income families, you have members of the family who work multiple jobs, meaning that they have their normal, regular job, but then they also have side jobs that they do in order to earn additional income. So that demographic change does play an impact in that as well. And then, of course, we talk about the New World Order. This was something that Reagan promoted, especially about after the Cold War, about interventionism, about the fact that the United States will intervene if they feel like if there's a threat to our well-being. And of course, Reagan not really opposed communism. He did it through his speeches. He did it through his acts of diplomacy, the military interventions that happened, and of course the buildup of weapons. But pretty much, it was a lot of money that was going into the Cold War. We saw an increase in military spending. We saw an increase in trying to deal with the economic issues of trying to keep communism from flowing into other countries. And so now what we're trying to figure out is, now that this war has ended, where do we stand as a country? Are we still being seen as a world power, or are we being seen as a nuisance? You have a lot of different countries that sometimes don't really like the power of America, or they don't see us as a friend. Um, I'm looking at some of the answers here, and it's been very interesting. Liliana Arias, she was the first person to answer that question correctly. So I appreciate that. And as far as the names that we will give for this era, we talked about digital reformation, America's dynamic era, the global age. So very interesting names that we could kind of give this era, and kind of remember that as you're going through and thinking about your DBQ and possible responses of, what would period 9, if it was ever given a name, what could period 9 be known as? We got to look at the shifts that happened with the attacks on 9/11. When you think about it, as a traveler, I've seen tremendous changes, especially like in airport with security. Prior to 9/11, we didn't have TSA. Your family could actually walk you to the gate. You could carry your luggage. You didn't have any of these restrictions about everything has to fit in a quart size bag and you can't have anything over 3 ounces. Those types of things. And there are certain things you aren't allowed, bottles of water and things like that. 9/11 pretty much changed all of that. We talked about a lengthy and controversial military efforts with Iraq and Afghanistan that started in the Bush's era and continued well into the Obama era. The fact that we were targeting Saddam Hussein, and then later Osama bin Laden is going to be the target. And remember, Saddam Hussein has been on our radar since the Gulf War. So way back in the early 80s, he was kind of in the radar then. And then, of course, it continues on. This war on terrorism, again, will lead to the oil crisis, another oil crisis that happened. And of course, the war on terrorism, talking about civil liberties, tapping into people's telephones, being able to listen into conversations. Whether you guys realize it or not, but this war on terrorism is still in existence today. They are trigger words, things like if you type something in an email that will consider to be a threat, Homeland Security does have a right to come to your home and question you. So you have to be especially careful about what you put out there in your digital footprint. Those types of things are all residual effects of what happened with 9/11. And then we talked about U.S. Dependence on fossil fuels and the fact that we're continuously being dependent on fossil fuels that come from the Middle East, and things that are happening with all of the fossil fuels that we're using. Are we doing a climate shift? The fact that the polar ice caps were melting, or they're still melting, the shift in the environment, what erosion, so many different things that are still happening that we're paying the price for all of the decisions that were made, in those periods that happened prior to then. And then, of course, the fact is we've already passed into the 21st century. Are we still considered a superpower now? Like, do other countries see us as that superpower that we once were at the end of World War II? All right. So, one of the things that I want you to kind of keep in mind as we kind of go through our guided practice is the fact that all of those things are contributions to this era. And when we talk about causation, we're looking at things that things that happen that cause us to be where we are now. If we look at the situation with the climate, all of those things that happened, the fossil fuels, the use of land, the dependence on oil, not looking for fuel alternatives, could be something that we could say that would lead to climate change. So when you're thinking about causation, it is things that happened in the past that lead us or has led us up into the point that we're at now. And so as you're kind of thinking about that when we're going through our guided practice, those are very important things because again, we're not done with this era. We're still living in it, and there's no telling when this cutoff of this era will be, and there will be a period 10. But we know that we're going to get there eventually. All right, so here is a question. This is from George W. Bush. This is the State of the Union address that happened in 2002. And so the question you're going to ask is, the sentiments expressed in the excerpt above most contributed to which of the following? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to read the paragraph and think about the question. Okay, guys. And so again, the sentiments expressed in the excerpt above most directly contribute to which of the following? And the answer would be D. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. Remember when you're looking at things, make sure that you're reading everything verbatim, that you're actually kind of looking through. When you're doing your documents analysis inside of your DBQ, remember that you are allowed, well, this time you won't be because it's going to be online, but normally you're able to kind of write some notes out. So as you're kind of thinking about your DBQ and kind of thinking about that and going through that, kind of write some notes out to yourself about things that, could possibly lead to these potential answers. And of course, there's always some possibilities. I know that when I gave this question to some students, the first thing they said was, A, the national sense of the Cold War was over. Well, we had already established that the Cold War had already ended. There was no need for a national sense for the Cold War to be over because we had started focusing on different things once the Bush administration came about. However, that all changed with the Gulf War. And so that's why you're looking at the U.S. Led invasion of Iraq, because they're going to be the focal point during this time. And it started way back then, and it's going to continue on and when W. Bush. So it started with his father, and it's going to continue to be W. Bush's focus in 2002. And of course, that's really going to be more in the prevalent, in the forefront focus because of the fact of things that happened with 9/11. All right, so this is an Interior Secretary, James Watt, and this is an interview that he did for the U.S. News and World Report. So the question you're going to answer is, the question above was most likely a response to the conservatives' call for, so remember we're talking about conservatism during this time, about how it's really going to come into the forefront with the election of Reagan, also with Newt Gingrich kind of leading that. Remember, conservatives did not like the fact that, they did not want to have a strong central government. They thought the government had too much power. Liliana Arias, of course, got that correct with the fact that they would have been Jeffersonian Democrats because they didn't want to have a strong central government. So kind of keep all of that in mind as you're reading through the response and answering that question. Okay, and the response to this question would be B, decrease regulations on industries such as oil production. And again, kind of looking at the fact that he was talking about environmental protection, drilling in the outer continental shelf. He's mentioning the fact of the two oil spills that they had since 1970. That was a huge, huge, huge controversy that's still being fought today. And then, of course, he's talking about the Mexican offshore well that went out of control in 1979. And so, kind of looking at what he's basically saying, you can kind of ascertain that he is basically talking about oil drilling and about the fact that you know, all of this was kind of precipitated from the Exxon Valdez situation that happened with the oil spill that happened, and how I think that's still being in the legislation today, and I think they're still kind of working on selling that as well. I know that Mr. Horton has asked the Twitter universe about what do you think are the most important changes that's happened in 40 years. Don't forget to tweet your answers. I'm going to acknowledge some of those responses as we get to the end of the lesson today. All right, so let's go ahead and check for understanding just to make sure that you guys really kind of understand what is expected of you, because normally with this period, it's usually only 5% of your exam. So it usually will come in the form of like a multiple choice question. But what we want to be able to have you to do is that, I know we've gotten a lot of questions about the complexity and about how you're able to do that. So if you're able to pull from a period further up, even if you're able to pull from if the question came from something that happened in period 6, and you're able to recall something that we talked about in either periods 8 or 9, that can kind of help you if you word it correctly and do it correctly. You can kind of get that complexity point. All right. So yesterday you guys went through political cartoons, and I really, really, really want to kind of reiterate what political cartoons are and what they're meant to be. And we're going to actually do a little practice with some political cartoon. So make sure you understand as you're looking through it that political cartoons always try to communicate powerful ideas. They're often use humor in order to make a point. So don't try to look at them and be so literal. That's why we always say make sure that you pay attention to everything that's in the drawing. For example, if you were looking at some of her blocks and he was talking about the situation that happened with Watergate, there was a very good one of Nixon having a trail of tapes that bones that had names on there, and there was a dog that was following them. And if you actually looked at it, the bones actually had names of all those people who were indicted inside of Watergate scandal and actually lost their positions. So remember, they often try to use humor to make a point. And they also try to incorporate important events and people of the period as an easy way to understand format that help you kind of understand or be able to relate, even if you don't really kind of read well. So if you're looking at this political cartoon, of course, this is just kind of looking at the election that happened with this past election. You can kind of see it. There's a reference here to Donald Trump. You'll see that when he says, Luke, I am your front runner. And here you see the elephant, which is a symbol for the Republican Party. Kind of using that montage from the Star Wars when Darth Vader informed Luke that he was his father. And of course, the elephant is screaming out, no, kind of the same as Luke. There's the humor in it. But basically, what he's saying is that he is the candidate that will be the front runner for the Republican Party for the election. Here on this side, you will see this is Hillary Clinton. You will see the differences. You'll see Bernie Sanders posters. You will see all the different things that were used, his campaign slogans, feel the burn. And, Hillary is saying, girls, when you get done mourning over a guy who's way too old for you, I could use a little help. Here, basically just trying to say that she's going to be the Democratic runner for this election. So again, using humor and kind of those things as, a way to kind of communicate or help you relate or understand the event that's about to happen. So thinking about everything that I talked about with the past and kind of going through the rest of period 9, I'm going to give you a political cartoon and give you a few minutes to see if you can understand the historical context of what's being conveyed here. So I'll give you a few minutes. All right, so you see there's a Statue of Liberty. You'll notice what she has in her hand is a gas nozzle, and you'll notice that her light has went out. And so she's basically getting ready to restart her light. And so she's putting gas into the light. So the historical context could be anything. We could mention the oil crisis that happened. Remember, I kind of talked to you guys about the fact that during the Great Recession, we did kind of go through a mini oil crisis where the oil was not coming in. We weren't getting it from the Middle East because of the war that we were fighting on terrorism. And so as a result of this, the oil prices kind of went up astronomically. Gas prices went high in a very, very short period of time. And then also too, the types of oil that was being shipped, they had to have went through so many refineries that there were certain states that were not accepting oil so steadfastly. So we had gas stations that were actually running out of gas. And so this is what the historical context is talking about, the oil crisis that happened during the Great Recession. And if you were to think about it, I told you guys this is not the first time that we've had an oil crisis. Kind of thinking back, if you could remember, or maybe your teacher may have mentioned it, anybody think of a time period or who was president when we went through the first oil crisis? Or if you can give me the actual decade. If you just give me the decade, that'll work too. You don't have to necessarily give me the president. So we're talking about in 2000s. Yes, we went through a second oil crisis, but if anybody can identify when we went through the first oil crisis, tweet your answers to Mr. Horton. That'll be phenomenal. See who can come up with it first. So remember kind of looking at the context, looking at her face, paying attention to all of the symbols, kind of looking at, okay, this is the oil, kind of thinking, okay, this is 1980, period 9. What would have been the context of this? And this is basically just talking about the Great Recession that happened during that time. All right, here's another one. And this one actually has a question. So it says, the effects depicted in the political cartoon above can best be ascribed to what? So give you a few minutes, see if you can figure this one out. All right, looking at this political cartoon, you'll see that this is actually Reagan. He is pushing a lawnmower that says tax cuts. If you'll look in the back, you'll notice that these are actually missiles. And then, of course, the mushroom here says deficits. And the woman is saying, "Look, dear, while we slept, this nice man went and printed up our front yard." And of course, he's saying, "Where did they see the backyard?" So, what if the effects of depicted in the cartoon above can be best ascribed to what? Think about it. We got this. We got all this in the back. So it would be a large U.S. military buildup. Remember with Reagan, the tax cuts, and also kind of looking into that whole SCI situation, this is what that thing is depicting. And, again, kind of pay attention because sometimes what political cartoonists will do is they will put, names or countries on the symbols like these. It may not be big or kind of apparent when you first look at it, but if you look very closely at it, you can kind of see those depictions there. So great job if you got that answer correct. All right, so let's just do a quick debrief and summary. So 5 things I want you guys to remember about period 9, if nothing else. Number one, that Reagan's victory in 1980 was a defining moment for a new conservative movement that had gained strength in the 1970s. Remember, they were considered to be the silent majority, is what they were referred to during the Nixon, when Nixon was actually running for office. The second thing is that increased military buildup and more assertive foreign policy as Reagan administration sought to end the Cold War. Thinking about the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars thing about how they wanted to put technology and put ways in order to track missiles so that they can actually stop them inside of space. You looked at advances in science and technology soared to new heights, especially in the 90s. Developments in digital technology and the birth of the internet revolutionized the economy and transformed the world. We also entered into a new era of globalization. Globalization is not something that is new to us; it's just a new type of globalization. Remember, we compared globalization to mercantilism, about how some countries utilize other countries in order for them to benefit, or like with the definition for mercantilism, where you have these pieces of parcel of land or places or settlements exist in order to enrich the motherland, the mother country. So kind of thinking along that way, and also kind of remembering that, smartphones, World Wide Web, all of that stuff did not exist until you got into the 90s. You also need to look at the United States continued to see large shifts in demographics and populations. Are we new to the whole shift in demographic population? No, we've always seen trends in immigration that has happened. It's happened early. We've had several immigration acts that have been put into place, but now we're really going to start to see that immigration now with these shifts is going to cause for more intense debates over social issues like race, gender, family structures, and diversity or the lack thereof. And if you're looking at the things that I'm telling you, remember these are all causes and effects. And then finally, the conflict in New York, in the Middle East increase. That will be an effect. Why? Because of the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon. You also had the United States engaged in military action against Afghanistan and Iraq. And another big thing is that the war on terrorism presented new challenges for U.S. leadership, which led to changes both domestic and foreign policy. Talking about countries that we will no longer deal with acts of terrorism. I told you about some of the domestic changes. I told you about how, especially like in the airport with TSA, all those different things that you guys have to go through now, taking off your shoes, etc. We did not have to do that prior to the 9/11 attacks. So all of those are effects of what was caused by the September 11th attacks. So when you're looking at the scale of causation, remember, causation always leads to an effect, and that effect can be either positive or it can be negative. It just really depends on what the situation is. So key takeaways is the relative significance of changes in the period after 1980 on American national identity. The thing about it is we're still trying to figure that out. But I think that the biggest thing that most of you have figured out is that our national identity is really, really incumbent upon technology. That is pretty much what runs our country right now. That is how we disseminate information out. This is how we are able to acquire. When you think about social media, how you're able to keep in contact with people that you went to school with, that didn't exist prior to, later. When you think about it, like almost into the late 90s or actually into the 2000s. You think about things like Facebook, and you think about Twitter and you think about Snapchat, all those things precipitated because of the need for people to want to be able to reach out to people more. So now you're able to have friends that are located in various countries, which would not have happened prior to into the digital age. So again, I think our national identity is really heavily incumbent upon digital age. So I like those guesses of those individuals who basically said that we're probably in a digital age or the age of technology. Uh, we already kind of talked about the conservative movement and about the policies and political structures and how it kind of moved into the 80s and will continue on. We talked about the 21st century and how we're in a different century now and about those technological and economic changes that kind of move forward. And of course, the biggest thing is at the end of the Cold War will present new challenges as far as our role in America. Are we going to be seen as as an American, as America in power, which is what we're kind of a world power. And that's what we're really trying to focus in on. And so again, the learning objective is, we looked at a lot of events and you guys are supposed to tweet your answers, but which major events do you think from 1945 to 1980, and then of course from 1980 going forward, really, really kind of help reshape our national identity? Again, I kind of told you it was a brief overview. So very quickly, if you want to take a picture of this QR code, or if you want to take a picture of the link there with your phones, or you can scan it. But I call this the ABCs of period 9, which will go in more depth of people that you can kind of look up on your own and kind of make some association when it comes to period 9. All right, so let's do a little exam practice. We're going to look at a short answer question very quickly, really kind of talking about conservatism here. And so we're going to answer all three parts. So the question is, the resurgence of political conservatism in the 1980s and 90s emboldened conservatives in their efforts to reshape American society. So for part A, you're going to say, briefly explain one economic goal that conservatives were able to achieve in the 1980s or 1990s. So if you're going to answer this question, you're going to either focus in on either one period. You're going to look at the 1980s or the 1990s. You're not going to have to worry about both. So take a few minutes. Okay, so some possible responses. You could talk about wanting to reduce taxes, wanting to limit the whole entitlement, the sense of entitlement, wanting to deregulate businesses. So those would be some potential answers that you could come up with as far as those changes. So part B says, briefly explain one social goal that conservatives were able to achieve during the 1980s or 90s. So here's the thing. To keep you on a track, if you focus in on 1 year for part A, try to make sure that you maintain that for part B. You can kind of switch off if you choose to, but sometimes you can kind of get confused. But usually that's why we kind of talk about making a list of things that you know. So kind of looking at social changes here. So this will be something that that you would kind of keep in mind. And remember, you only need to do it for the 80s or the 90s. You don't have to do it for both. All right. So you could talk about the fact that they sought to establish a social morality through government. They wanted to eliminate those liberal reforms from the 60s and the 70s and reverse what they would consider to be the moral decay. So, looking at those things that happened during the 60s, remember I told you about culture and counterculture, the era of free love, living in communes, those types of things. Those will be those liberal reforms that they wanted to try to reverse in order to kind of consider as you're looking at the moral decay. All right, so then here's part C. Remember, same question. And remember when you're doing a short answer, uh, even though this is not going to be in your test, you still need to kind of understand this because it all kind of correlates. Remember, it needs to be very brief, no more than 3 to 4 sentences, and not even 4 sentences. If you can answer it in 2 or 3, that'll actually be better. Part C says, provide at least one specific piece of additional evidence to demonstrate how conservatives were able to implement the economic or social goal that you discussed in Part A or Part B. So again, you're only looking at one specific additional piece of information that you discussed in Part A or Part B, not both. All right, so here's something you could talk about. You could say conservatives successfully passed a massive tax cut in 1981 under the administration of Ronald Reagan. You could also talk about in 1996 about how the Republican-controlled Congress successfully passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, known as welfare reform. You could also mention, like in 1982, there was conservative agitation. Because of conservative agitation, the United States failed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have banned discrimination based on gender. That was something that, again, during the feminist movement under Gloria Steinem, they were trying to get this amendment passed. And then you could also talk about how, because of pressure from conservatives, Clinton administration adopted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy for gays in the military rather than allowing gays to openly serve. And kind of think about everything that Mr. Horton kind of talked to you about that, about the backlash that Clinton suffered from the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and about how while it may have been had a good intentions at the way it was implemented, it had some issues. All right, so something to think about as we continue moving forward. We will start reviewing periods 1 through 7 beginning on Monday. We will cover things that will be on your 2020 APUSH exam. Keep in mind that for the first period, we will kind of do some DBQ skills, but remember, period 1 was only going to be 5% of your exam anyway, so there would not necessarily have been a DBQ that would have been applicable to period 1 as well. So our schedule is going to be a little different. I know you guys are used to seeing us come on every other day. I'm going to start us off on Monday with period 1, and then you may see Mr. Horton, I think, on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then I'll come back on Thursday, and then Mr. Horton will be here on Friday. So thank you for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Thank you, teachers, for your love and support. We appreciate it as well. We will continue our journey as we make sure that your students are ready for this exam. And again, if you have any questions, make sure you hit us on Twitter at @virtualapush. And remember, if you are having technical difficulties or you know someone who is, please make sure you reach out to College Board at cb.org/tech. All right, you guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a good weekend and happy Easter.